Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our Zoom today. I can't wait to hear from Dr. Irina Stotland, but I'll get to her in just a moment. A couple of reminders. One more day is left on the Colorist show, which is at the mansion right now. I hope it's the mansion's open tomorrow. I think it is. But if you haven't seen it, you should. Coming, right after that, we'll install next week is the Gaithersburg Camera Club. So we're going from going from paintings with lots of colors to photos with lots of colors. And of course, when that show comes down, it'll be our spring members juried show. We had another huge turnout of entries, close to 200. They're with the judge right now. And we'll be hearing back from her soon, and we'll let those that were accepted, know that they were accepted. Of course, it's got a lot of entries, and there's only so much room in the mansion, good and bad. The good thing is that we have lots and lots of work to choose from, and that usually results in a wonderful show. The tough part about it is not every piece that's entered can find its place. It's the judge's vision what prevails. So that's just a short couple of announcements. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Irina Stotland, and we're so glad to have her. She's been a friend to Rockville Art League. She presents usually in September, which has become kind of a tradition. She's judged a show for us once. But when I heard that a Bonnard exhibit was going up at the Phillips, I immediately reached out to Dr. Stotland because Lisa and I had taken a class with her on Les Nabis. I don't know if I said that right, but which of course Bonnard was one of the primary members. We'll hear more about that in a moment. Dr. Stotland got her PhD in art history from Bryn Mawr. Her interest and specialty is post-impressionism, and she's published a number of articles about Paul Gauguin and others, but she's famous for her Gauguin expertise. And as I mentioned before, she's also taught a course on Les Nabis. Again, her talk is timely because Bonnard is on display at the Phillips, and I think we're so lucky to have her. So without further ado, Dr. Irina Stotland, thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna start sharing the lecture and then, wait. Uh-oh, I can't share. Can I share?
Yes, you can. There you go. You got it.
Okay, let me hide this. Whoops. Sorry, Patrick. Give me a second. All right. Everybody can hear me, see me? Seeing is probably more important. So
yes,
we are gonna ask everybody to mute themselves, and then I'm gonna give you a chunk of information portion of the lecture, and then I'm gonna say, let's discuss this, or do you have any questions? So please hold your questions until I open it up for discussion, just in the interest of time management. Okay? Everybody, so no technical difficulties as of yet, correct? Okay.
You see it on the screen, it's looking good.
Okay, so today I have about an hour and 10 minutes to talk about the Nabi or Le Nabi. You don't pronounce the S in French. So at the end. So I titled it Pleasures of Pattern because we will talk about the decorative surface effect that the Nabi are recognized by. It's basically how you identify a painting as a Nabi. And I've centered it on Pierre Bonnard, but I wanted to talk about other people that worked with him, some of them more closely aligned than others. So you're going to see 4 artists today and maybe some extraneous pictures. So the Nabi comes from an Arabic word that they picked out, which means a prophet, and they describe themselves as the ancient prophets that rejuvenated Israel. Nobody was particularly humble in the group, as as you can see. So who are they? The Nabi were a group of students that met at this private art academy in Paris, the Académie Julian, and they formed this sort of semi-secret chat. They would be on Twitter now, but it was the 19th century, so it was in real life. They had their own sort of code words, and every member had a nickname that I'm gonna explain for you. The objective was to basically revolutionize art. So they formed the group in the late 1880s. They had their first exhibit in 1889 under the title of the Impressionist and Synthesis Group, which included Paul Gauguin, who was their main source of inspiration. But 10 years later, because the Nabi is a very short-lived group, and it's a very short-lived style, even though it was very impactful. So just 10 years later, in 1899, the movement, the group, split into two. You had the mystics and the intimists. And the mystics, like Paul Sirousier or Maurice Denis, preferred their preferred subject matter were spiritual mysteries, or this sort of symbolist take on Christian theology. And they had very bright colors, but fairly simple compositions. So they were called the mystics. And another camp where we can find Bonnard and his friend Vuillard, their images were darker, and they were not interested in any sort of mystical, imaginary subject matter, but rather in the observation of the world, but in a subjective sort of take on reality. They're less concerned with figure and much more concerned with the surface effect. So their subject matter is very, very ordinary. They painted the middle class interior, but it's always imbued with the sense of mystery. So they're called the intimists because it's all about the sort of the familial ties or the friendships within these interiors. But they're incredibly psychologically complex because it's a sort of an image of human relationships or underlying conflicts in this very sort of stable bourgeois world that they give us. So the last exhibition that the Nabi had was in 1900, so right at the beginning of the 20th century. So how did they define themselves? They actually defined themselves in opposition to the previous avant-garde movement, which was the Impressionism. And as Bonnard said, the profoundness of our emotions comes from the sufficiency of these lines and these colors to explain themselves. Everything is contained in the beauty, which means the Impressionists were not concerned with the emotions. They were not concerned with the individual psyche. That's the realm of the post-Impressionists, of which Nabi are a part. Impressionists observed reality and gave us the optical reality of the light, right? That was their metaphor for modernity. The post-Impressionists and the Nabi in particular were focused on the hidden, on the secret, on the subconscious sort of reality of humanity. And the emotion and the conveyance of that secretive world for them should be done through the formal means. So the emotions, as he says, conveyed through the lines and the colors, through the beauty, through the formal elements. So it's a completely different aesthetic objective than the Impressionist ones. one, and it's not to reflect, not to depict nature, but to convey sensations that that nature provokes in you, in an individual. So it's a subjective take on nature, and to be decorative. And because it's a group, there is a range of styles in that group that all fall under the same aesthetic objective. And they also, besides for challenging the whole premise of what art is, they also challenge this idea of the hierarchy of the medium. So they use the wide range of medium, oil paintings, screens, mural, and very sort of applied things, which would be called craft more than art, decorative arts. Like they designed wallpaper, tapestries, china, textiles, and even furniture, which none of which I'm going to show you, which is going to concentrate on painting. So I need to start, when we talk about the Nabi, I need to start with the introduction of a person who basically invented the style, and that is Paul Sirousier. There he is. Each member of the Nabi had a truly, truly glorious facial something. As we will see. So he comes from a very well-off family. His father is very successful perfumer, and he goes to a very good school where he gets a degree in philosophy and science, and then he decides to become an artist, and he joins the Julian Academy, where he makes friends with all the other artists who are looking to innovate and revolutionize. In 1888, he has this pivotal meeting. He travels to the south of France, to Pont-Aven, and he meets Paul Gauguin there, Paul Gauguin and Emile Bernard, who have just invented this movement of symbolism, which flattens the shapes, which uses very strong black outlines, which uses really saturated, unmodeled flat color. And so if Sirousier abandons Impressionist style and abandons any sort of pretense to three-dimensionality in art and starts to work in that style, in that more abstract style. And we're going to talk about a particular painting next that he makes with Gauguin in Pont-Aven. In 1895, Sirousier actually joins a Benedictine monastery in Germany. And the artist monks who work there explain to him their philosophy of the divine laws of beauty. It's not actually their philosophy, it's this Platonic idea of beauty and divine beauty, meaning perfection. So they see it as being hidden in nature, and only select fews, which are the artists, can see that beauty. So it's a sort of a spiritual definition of what art is and what an artist is. So his nickname in the Nabi group is the Nabi with a shining beard. And he is a mystic, just like Denis, and the shining beard is full of mysticism and wisdom. His sources of influence are, there's a range: ancient Egyptian art, the Italian primitives, the Middle Ages, specifically the tapestries. And he sees decorative art specifically as timeless because it survives for a time. So when Sirousier is in Pont-Aven, he paints this painting, which is, the original title is the Avon River at the Bois d'Amour. This is at d'Orsay Museum. And when he is painting it, he's painting it in a group of the followers of Gauguin, and Gauguin starts sort of proselytizing to them. And he says, and that's a very famous quote by Gauguin, he asks them, "How do you see these trees? They're yellow, so put some yellow. The shadow, it's rather blue, painted with pure ultramarine. Those red leaves, put vermilion." So that quote encapsulates this idea that your concept of reality takes precedence over the conventional idea of reality, or even of what you know that color to be. Your perception in that moment is more truthful than that color in a neutral light, because it's truthful in that particular moment to you. So it's subjectivity over conventionality and over observation. It's based on observation, but it comes from within rather than from without. So art, to the post-impressionism and to the Nabis, is not an imitation of the visible. It's not about reproducing reality. It is about conveying the emotions of the artist who is observing reality, or they call them sensations. And the choice of the form, the choice of the color that the artist deems appropriate to convey that particular emotion. So you are free to liberate your color from a descriptive function. It can symbolize your emotion instead. So you can use pure, saturated, flat color. You can flatten the shapes because it's not an illusionistic shape. It's sort of your feeling about the shape. Okay. So Sirousier, that's a quote from Sirousier, which I sort of now just described to you. He says, free form and color from the traditional emotions and spiritual truths. So he cloaks it in this sort of mystical language of the quest for authenticity, which is going inward for them. So he brings this painting to his friends at the Academy Julian, and they look at it and they name it the talisman. It becomes the emblem, the talisman of the movement. And as Maurice Denis would say, thus we were presented for the first time in a form that was paradox and unforgettable, the fertile concept of a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order. And that is Denis' definition of a painting, that no matter what, no matter how illusionistic anybody can get, or naturalistic, it will still be a flat surface covered with colors artificially assembled by an artist. This acknowledgement of the truth of the medium, which starts out this whole move toward abstraction, and sort of Jackson Pollock is going to become an epitome there. So this is an example of what Sirousier produces. He produces these mystic scenes. So what is happening in the 19th century that mysticism becomes fashionable? You have this, as in any society, when you have, in the Western society, I should say, when you have a jump in the industrial development, when new technology is invented, when everything becomes modern all of a sudden, there is conventionally, typically, without an exception, a sort of an opposing force to it, emotionally opposing force to it. And people sort of try to escape this modernization, this industrialization, as they did in the 19th century, and they start to do seances, spiritual seances, or they start to believe in hypnotism or mesmerism, as they called it then, or there are all of these sort of, all of a sudden, there are lots of people seeing ghosts, or there are miracles that happen. It's sort of a balancing social mechanism, I guess, that we have. So there's symbolist literature, there's symbolist music, there's symbolist theater that is all interested in the mysticism. So this is the Incantation or the Sacred Wood from 1891. And it has to do with Sirousier ending up in Brittany, just like Gauguin did. And Brittany is this area in France that is seen as very backward, it is a rural area, but because it's the 19th century, any sort of area that is perceived as outside of the modernization of France will therefore be perceived as more authentic. So there's this very, factually, there's this very rich Celtic pagan tradition in Brittany that's been preserved within Christianity. So that becomes the focus of Seruzier paintings, of many of his paintings, this sort of mystic spirituality. You wouldn't necessarily recognize it as Christian, but it's a meld of both Breton legends, the religion, the pagan traditions, all of this together. So there we have this magical forest at night. You can see it that it's the night because of the sky in the distance. That's this deep purple. And then they have these two deep purple dresses and these absolutely non-naturalistically colored bright red verticals of the trees. And three Breton women, which in 19th century view would recognize as Breton because they're wearing the traditional Breton dress. And they are in the middle of this forest as Druid priestesses and doing some sort of a ritual, some sort of an incantation over the fire. There she is holding her very elongated hand over the flames. We don't know what is happening. And we're not supposed to understand what is happening because it's a mystery. So, but you do have this incredibly joyful, I think, coloristic, decorative surface. You could take this and make it into a tapestry or into a mosaic or into a stained glass. You can repeat it on a wallpaper. There is this acknowledgement of flatness. It's not supposed to fool you into believing that this is real. This is this very mosaic-like, tapestry-like decorative surface, a pattern of complementary colors, red and green, or purple and yellow, the colors that produce the greatest perceived luminosity of their contrast. So that is what mystics are doing. Let me open this up a little bit. Do you have any questions about the introduction or Seruzier before we move on to Denis and then to Bonnard? Sarah?
Irina, any idea how large this painting is that's on the screen right now?
It is, so it's 91.5 centimeters. So you have to divide it by 2.2. So about, I don't know, 38 inches. It's not humongous.
But it's not a real small painting either. So that's
right,
okay, interesting.
Right. We're gonna see some very large paintings just in a minute. This is so there is no sort of they make whatever they want. There is no set preference really for anything. They make smaller paintings and larger ones, and huge murals as well.
One last question. I'm sorry, but sometimes the word decorative for artists who consider themselves fine artists is like a dirty word.
Yes, that's precisely what they're trying to destroy, that hierarchy.
Okay. All right.
So what they're saying is art should be decorative. High art should be decorative, and it should be applied and sort of useful. Yes, Ellen, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. You mentioned that the artists would choose colors that they felt expressed their reaction or emotional reaction to what they're seeing. Do you know how they categorize those colors, or how they determine what colors would be happy colors, what colors would be sad colors?
Oh, well, I mean, there is a sort of a conventional language of color, especially in the 19th century. And it would be, I think it's still understood by a person who has a Western background. So red is for passion, right? Green is for spring and sort of rejuvenation. That is for mourning or an omen of some sort. So there's another post-impressionist artist who said, when everybody knows that the line of a weeping willow is sad, how do we know it's sad? Because it's going downward. So it's not really that complicated, just sort of a conventional cultural iconography, I would say.
You know, this is Peter. The green in the florist floor is very weird. It doesn't look like any green or grass or forest I've ever seen.
Because it's not supposed to. It's not supposed to describe or create an illusion that is naturalistic. It is supposed to be sort of a subjective perception.
Yeah.
So the color is liberated from its descriptive function, to put it in their complicated language.
It definitely works. It almost looks more like smoke than anything.
Right, like clouds, sort of.
Yeah, clouds.
Acid green clouds, yes.
How did the public react to these wild colors and
So
non-representational?
the public, it depended on which, right. It depends on which part of the public you would, I guess, you would ask, right? The post-impressionists obviously had the fans, the crowd, but even the most famous of them, like Gauguin or Van Gogh, were not financially successful until later, until I would say the beginning of the 20th century. So this was truly a shocking avant-garde moment. Okay, let me move on to the next artist. So this is still a mystic. This is Maurice Denis, and he is from a working class family, and he, since a very early age, he was very much interested in religion, a deeply spiritual person, and his degree was in philosophy. As you can see, all of these people are very well educated, very well-read all men. So he joins the studies at the Julian Academy, then passes the entrance exam to the highest institution, the Fine Arts Academy of France in Paris. And his sources of inspiration, besides for Raphael, are also the Italian primitives. This is what they're known as. We wouldn't call them primitives now. So Fra Angelico, Botticelli, these sorts of artists. In 89, again, Gauguin pops up in his life. He sees an exposition of Gauguin, a private exhibition, and he says that it shook him. He says, in place of windows opening on nature like the Impressionists, these were surfaces which were solidly decorative, powerfully colorful, bordered with brutal strokes, partitioned. So again, this sort of denial of illusionism, the acknowledgement of what the painting is, and it's a surface with the pigment on it. It's a flat surface. So he is truly a mystical artist, but unlike Seruzier, he is a Christian artist. And he sees his paintings as a celebration of the divine. So his nickname was the Nabis of the beautiful icons. And this is a sort of thing that he produced. Again, this is a Brittany landscape close to a 12th century medieval chateau, a castle in Brittany. And he described this land as the land where you prayed. So this is landscape with green trees from 1893. And as you can see, it's fairly similar in terms of its aesthetic choices to what we've seen with Seruzier. This very strong decorative patterning of the surface. It's one of my favorite paintings to make it personal. I think just the way that he develops color is absolutely glorious. This sort of opaque, chalky green and pink, and the golden yellow of the trees in the background, and this expanse of the cloudy sky. So again, this is structured on the contrast of the very strong verticals, the trees, which we sort of starting to see the foliage of, and one very strong horizontal, which is a border here. You can sort of see the fence over the border. And then you have these cloaked women in, in hooded pink robes moving towards the fence, and one woman who seems to be kneeling, and then you can make out the figure of an angel over there. Can you see it with the wings? And he is contrasted, he is made visible really by contrast because he is silhouetted against this orangey gold clouds of the trees, which then become the clouds of the sky and the sort of lapis lazuli coming through. So if you spend some time in front of this painting, you'll see that this is Christian iconography, but yet again, it's happening in these Breton woods, in these pagan druidic forests, very ancient ones. Everything is flattened, everything is simplified, a very restricted range of color, and it packs a punch, I would say. Do you have any questions about Maurice Denis? So these two, Denis and Sirousier, are my examples of the mystic group within the Nabis. Okay, so moving on to the next camp, these are the intimists. So there's nothing mystical there. I mean, outwardly mystical. There's still mysteries, nothing religious. And so this is the focal point of this talk. This is Pierre Bonnard. He comes from a very well-off family and a very socially important family. His father is a senior official at the Ministry of War. So this is a sophisticated family. He gets a degree in classics, and his father wants for him to become a lawyer. So he studies to be a lawyer and then takes the law exam and fails it, at which point he decides to become an artist. And he never wanted to be a lawyer, really. So he starts studying at the Julian Academy in 1808, and then he is accepted to the Academy of Fine Arts, during which time he has, the same year, he has his first commercial success. He produces a poster, which I'm going to show you. And the same year he joins the Nabis. He exhibits with the Society of the Independent Artists, not at the official salon. And he is incredibly influenced not just by Gauguin, but by Japanese artists that becomes quite fashionable in France, Hokusai. He exhibits with the Nabis 2 times. And when they split into 2 groups, he finds himself on the other side of Maurice Denis and Sirousier, who basically are the founding fathers of the group. So him and Bonnard are the intimists. So because he's so impacted, he is so much under the sway of the Japanese art, his nickname in the group is the very Japanese Nabis. And he looks at painting as a sort of a formal exploration, a formal experiment. He basically treats color as a language, as a music. There are rhythms and dialogues between, within his painting, between color and line. So how do you recognize Bonnard? It's going to be a domestic interior, or it's going to be a familial group in the garden. You will have very, very intense color areas, color patches, and it's going to be close values of color. So it's not going to be a huge range of them. He is so obsessed with the tones that he produces that he keeps retouching his paintings, sometimes years later. There's even an instance where him and Vuillard go to a museum where his painting has already been installed. And he convinces Vuillard to distract the museum guards because he wants to retouch the painting that's already hanging on the museum wall. So he's a little OCD about his colors. He never paints things while, from life. He always paints the memory, which is as anti-impressionist as you can get. He's not painting to capture a specific light. He's painting to capture his emotion. His memory is that much more distilled in terms of what he felt in front of the painting. So he says, I have all my subjects to hand. I go back and look at them. I take notes. Then I go home. And before I start painting, I reflect, I dream. It's a very subjective process. And he admits that it's anti-impressionist. He says, we were trying to go further than the impressionists and their naturalist impressions of color. After all, art is not nature. So there is, again, I'm overemphasizing it, but this is important. This is what post-impressionism is. Art is a subjective artificial construction to them. It's not an illusion of nature. He has a very interesting way of working. He'll hang up canvas rolls uncut, and he'll work on several of these canvases together, and then he'll cut them after he completes the painting, sometimes cutting off certain, sort of cropping them to his liking. So I'm going to show you one of his posters, but he is one of the people who, again, revolutionizes the genre. After, he works concurrently with Toulouse-Lautrec, who's really the genius of lithography during this time. But Bonnard is, not that shabby either. So this is what is a lithographic poster in the 19th century. It's an ad. It's a utilitarian printed, cheaply printed, mass-produced poster for a brand. So this is for France Champagne, and we see this very pretty girl as a focal point. Well, actually, the focal point is the bubbly, and it is the bubbles that at the center of the composition conceptually and geometrically and pictorially. So he wins this general design poster competition and produces this poster. And from that point on, he's well known. He's known as the winner. And this allows him to convince his parents that he can be an artist. He doesn't need to study law. So if you look at the poster, you already see the decorative patterning of the surface, this very strong contouring. And of course, it is necessary in this lithography. It's just 4 colors that is possible. It could be less, as here it's just 2 colors, and then the print, the cardboard, the paper left bare. You have to have a strong line because the poster needs to be visible from a distance. It's pasted on the walls of the houses. So that line, that curvilinear line, is the pattern. It becomes its own pattern, and it creates this sort of dynamic, the twirling dynamic in the pictorial field. So the line of her shoulders and her arm lead our eye to the glass of champagne. She tilts her head and tries to lean out of the poster. So that's another dynamic there. And the shape of her arm over here, very anatomically incorrect elbow, is an echo of the C. So the C for champagne is very much indicated to us as well. The C here and the glass over here. So the shape of the bubbles, the waterfall of the bubbles, is basically the shape of her hair. So there's all this movement, there's all this throw-off, this flirtiness. It's a very effective poster. It packs a punch, I think. Did you have any questions about the poster before we move on to the paintings by Bonnard, or comments?
And he was just like in his early 20s when he did this, correct?
Yes, in 1891, he was very young. So, and of course, posters, this is printed in 1891. He makes it originally in 89. Posters can be reprinted in quantities. Okay, so his paintings. I broke this down by subject. So this is one of my favorite by Bonnard. This is Twilight or the Game of Croquet from 1892. And this is one of his earliest works. And this is his family's garden and his family in that garden. And that's part of that sort of group of painting where he gives us parks and gardens. He gives us figures in nature, embedded in nature. So the subject matter of these green urban environments is a very impression. It's a subject that Impressionists really love. These are new spaces. Since Paris has been modernized, you have now urban parks, and some houses do have gardens. So this idea of taking pleasure in nature is here tied with taking pleasure in the familial ties. So there's his father with the graying beard. There's his sister with the dog, and his brother-in-law over here. And you can barely see there's another woman over here who's turned her face away from us. And then you have some girls in white dresses dancing in the background. You can't really identify them. So there's a sort of a lining up freeze effect in the foreground and a much more dynamic background. A really cluttered foreground left and a fairly open dynamic background right. And of course, our eye goes directly into the background because there's a path for us. It's made for us to enter there. This group is thinking about the croquet over here. You start looking, you sort of start to see the croquet mallets and the balls on the ground. And there's one over here by the, what is it called? A thicket, I think, in croquet. But the most important thing here is, of course, the pattern. And it's not just the pattern of the patches of color that he uses, that he constructs there. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, but it is also the pattern on the fabrics that camouflages the body. They almost disappear into the darkness, into the shaded darkness under the trees. So the pattern clothing and the pictorial surface as a patterned whole constructs this incredible decorative whole, this incredible decorative unity. This is, again, parks and gardens, but in a different format. So this was, they also, Bonnard and Vuillard loved this medium and this format of a decorative screen. So sometimes you would have separated panels that you would hang on the walls, on different walls in the same room, usually. And sometimes this would be a screen standing together. So this is women in the garden. This is glue paint over charcoal pencil chalk on paper. Then that is attached to canvas. And again, these are women from his family, the ones that we can see. His sister and his cousin, specifically in the first two. And this is also sort of a factor of that philosophy of integrating all art, erasing this hierarchy between high art and decorative art. So posters is one way of doing this, elevating the status of a poster to high art, or a screen, right, which is a very utilitarian object. And he says, our generation always was searching for connections between art and life. So this is exactly like the arts and crafts movement. The idea of art as bringing beauty into the ordinary environment. And of course, it is very much influenced by the Japanese decorative art, by the Japanese screens. And interestingly enough, just like the Japanese screens, you have to read it from right to left. Now, if you start to read it from right to left, you'll notice that the seasons change. There is the fall season, then there is the summer season, then there is the spring, and this looks to be like falling snow. Of course, she's wearing a dress, so it's not super specific, but it is the 4 seasons. So it's, you know, the screen is a sequential calendar cycle. Women in the gardens are still there, and it is incredibly beautiful. It is incredibly decorative. Again, you have this pattern, a different pattern for each screen, and then you have patterns within patterns. And he is absolutely obsessed with this, with the pattern on clothes. They become part of the overall sort of obfuscation of the body. The body is not as important as the pattern that the body makes. With the outline and with the pattern that clothes the body. And he does love his dogs and cats. You see a lot of them in Bonnard. So this was conceived as a single screen, and then he divided into 4 panels. It was, of course, easier to exhibit that way. This is, just wanted to sort of do a another category, even though it could fall under the parks and gardens sometimes, the fashionable women of Paris, the Parisians. Just wanted to show you how fashion played, the textile patterning became a focal point for Bonnard. So the dressing gown, the checkered blouse, and women with the dog. And the checkered blouse, of course, has a cat over here. Highly unhygienically touching the food on her plate. So how do you distinguish between a figure and a background, or a figure and its surroundings in Bonnard? You don't distinguish by an outline. You distinguish by a change in pattern. I hope you can see it. There's this wonderful checkered pattern, and then there is this solid, there are striations there, but much more solid, flat red. And that is how we're able to read this. The color is very close, as I was saying. The tonal values are very close in Bonnard. So there is this obfuscation, there is this illusion of the body, but you can't tell the difference here. So there's a very funny quote from Bonnard that I wanted to bring in. He says, "When my attention is directed toward men, I see only gross caricatures. I never feel so with women. I always find the means to isolate a few elements which satisfy me as a painter. It's not that men are uglier than women. They are only so in my imagination." So this is sort of the opposite of misogyny. But I think whether or not he realizes that he's talking about fashion, and he's talking about the much more diverse feminine fashion, because the male costume, the costume of a middle class man in the 19th century is black and white. It's not interesting. You can see the men here, two men and a woman in a brown cloak. And then the women allow him to revel in this pattern, the clothes that they're wearing. There are polka dots on her scarf. There are checkering on her dress. This has sort of tonality of blue all over. So this is his sister and his cousin. And they're playing with the dog, and they're completely absorbed in the activity and not paying attention to the people coming behind them. The checkered pattern, he actually borrowed from Chinese prints. It became fashionable to wear because it was, again, another Asian influence. So is he focusing on the people? Not so much as he's focusing on the geometry of the pattern and the color and light that sort of illuminates and hides parts of what is happening here. Very flat, very strongly outlined, very simplified, a claustrophobic compressed space, which allows him to construct it as a Lego, as a jigsaw puzzle. And of course, the dog in the front. Do you have any questions about this? The poster, the decorative screen, or the Parisians? Nobody has any questions?
Well, I think it's so interesting that he makes no attempt to have the contours of the pattern follow the body, like on the girl with the dog on the right there.
Yeah.
It's like it's the same check pattern, and there's very little change in the lines of the pattern to conform with her body shape.
Yes.
I just think that's so interesting.
The pattern is much more important than being truthful to the anatomy. You're right. Ellen, you had a question.
Yeah, sort of similar observation, and that is his drawing of the figure is often very distorted to mirror other patterns and shapes. His arms are curved in odd ways, and the shoulders are off. And I almost wondered, did he just never learn to draw the figure, or do you think he's trying to just integrate the figure into this pattern scheme that he's come up with?
So the artists that I'm talking about they know very well what they're doing. They're very intentional about this. They've all been trained how to draw the body. They've taken life model classes. This is very much on purpose. And the elongation of the deformation of the body is intentionally done to heighten this decorative nature, to create this decorative surface. The body has to fit in. It's not that the pictorial sort of logic revolves around the body. It is that the body needs to conform to whatever decorative surface he envisioned for the painting. So he'll stretch it, or he'll shorten it, or he'll deform it on purpose, absolutely on purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense. And he's always trying to mirror another shape too with what he does when he distorts. It's interesting to see how he distorts the body.
Yes. Okay. Sarah, did you have a question?
Well, I guess I'm looking at his use of space and depth, which of course the Impressionists used a lot of atmosphere and that kind of perspective. So in the women with the dog, he kind of has a piece in the front, which is a very kind of abstracted flower, 3 flowers, and the dog. They're the foreground, and so I don't know if he really cared that much about depth, but he ends up with depth in this painting because of scale and some other things. But it's not done with color, I guess is what I would say. It's just shape.
So you're absolutely correct. So there is no linear perspective, which gives you, well, there is a little bit. The objects in the distance are smaller than in the foreground. So that gives you sort of a hint that there is a space enough to fit all of these people. And there's also layering of shape that also creates the suggestion of depth, right? Because the dog has to be in front of the people who are in front.
You read it, layer 1, layer 2, and keep going.
But we don't have the classical linear construction, or we don't have the atmospheric perspective where things get cooler as they move away from us. Because again, the intention is to flatten.
Yeah.
The intention is not to create an illusion of reality with the illusion of depth. The objective is to create a decorative surface. It's not that they can't do it. It's just the aesthetic objective is different.
Right. That's interesting.
Oh, I hope so. All right. Domestic interiors. So this is still by Bonnard. This is one of his first intimate scenes, 1891. In this titled Intimacy, and it's a much darker painting because it's inside, and there's probably some sort of artificial light source here. So this is becoming less and less legible. You have to spend more and more time sort of parsing the things that we see in order to decipher them. It becomes sort of a code. It's a very cluttered, congested space. The color areas within the flattened pictorial field no longer necessarily describe the objects, meaning the color here exists independently of what it is supposed to describe. So you might have, let me explain this. So you can recognize this as a hand that is holding a cigarette. And yet the way that he constructs this hand is from these very abstract patches of color. It is as close to abstraction as you can get without going fully abstract. There is no longer really fingers. It's just a sort of a misshapen, it's a memory of a hand, as he would put it, rather than anything else. So less decorative and more abstract, more conceptual in his representation. So objects sort of dissolve and then they reappear, they merge. It looks sort of mysterious, right? It looks timeless in a way. So who are we looking at here? So this is his brother-in-law. He's a musician, a composer, Claude Terrasse. He's wearing this thick house coat and a hat for some reason. He's smoking a pipe. In the shadow with her sort of 3/4 with her shoulder to us, and we see her profile and the hand with the cigarette, that's Bonnard's sister, Claude's wife. And then where is Bonnard? Because it's obviously his house. This is Bonnard. This is his hand with another clay pipe. And this is a purple hand, talking about going against the naturalistic trend. So again, not descriptive, but conceptual. Now, the most sort of important thing here is how the spirals of smoke create the space, right? With the Impressionists, we're talking about the envelope, is what Monet called it, the envelope of light and color. Here, we're talking about the smoke and color. So there is the cigarette and the 2 clay pipes, and there is smoke coming out of them. And then it blends in what looks like a wallpaper until you notice that there's smoke sort of cutting through the wallpaper. You can sort of tell that this is smoke because it's floating against the frame. So the smoke becomes the wallpaper becomes the smoke. It's all very nebulous, very ambiguous, very atmospheric, right? So these arabesques create the air, well, the smoke inside the room. So there's a very famous poem during this time by a symbolist writer, Stéphane Mallarmé, who says, "Our whole soul is expressed when we slowly exhale rings of smoke abolished into other rings." So this is truly the soul. This is, if you take this is a riff on Mallarmé's poem. This is a portrait of his family, of the soul of his family, done through the smoke that they're exhaling. Another intimist painting. This is Coffee, or another title is Afternoon Tea. I don't know how, but I guess there's a scholarly discussion about what they're drinking. This is when Bonnard says, "I float between intimism and decoration. One does not reformulate yourself." I would posit that he doesn't float between them. It's one and the same. It's decorative and intimate. So this is really very avant-garde at the moment. It's still, the focal point is the pattern, but it's no longer even a pattern on a human body. It is on a table. It is an inanimate pattern that becomes central to this composition, to this horizontally arranged composition. So we are, the viewer or the artist, we're seated at the same table. which is seated opposite of the people that we are sort of catching a glimpse of. The color is incredibly bright and incredibly sort of jarring in its contrast, which makes it even brighter. So you have the blue in whatever is hanging on the wall, a tapestry or a painting, there's a lot of blue in there. Looks impressionistic to me. The blue dress and all the shadows are blue. You can see it here on the serving dish or the cup or the pot on the table. There is this incongruent shadow of the chair that the dog is sitting on, falling like a separate object onto the wall. You have this incredibly bright yellow of that dress with the orange hat. And of course, the most expensive patch of color is the red and white tablecloth that's offset by this black serving platter, which black is not a color. It's where color dies, but here it becomes the most visible patch of color because it's the darkest. So he's doing the opposite of what we usually do, making the brightest part lightest. And then you have this interesting device of framing the painting. You have the frame of that painting, which is exactly as the frame of our painting, for whatever that is, a drapery or a decorative frame that's painted over. It's hard to say. So it's this moment in time, this domestic moment in time, again, incredibly intimate, incredibly quiet. And the people who are either missing the face to look at us or are turned away from us and completely absorbed by whatever they're doing, in this case, by the dog. And even the dog is absorbed by looking at the tablecloth. Nobody's paying attention to us. And so that absorption creates this separate, perfect domestic world in which we're sort of peeping. We're not included in their little connection. Did you have any questions about this or comments?
Just
Sarah?
that they're very permissive with their pets at the table. Oh my God. The cat, the dog. Yikes.
Well, the dog at least is not in the food.
The dog doesn't have its paw in the food. That's true.
Yeah. So just a sort of a personal comment. The Nabis make me, I think, the happiest as a viewer. There is something about that world, that perfect sort of joyful, juicy colored world. Even if it's darker.
Have you seen this one in person by any chance?
It's at the Tate. I don't remember seeing it.
Okay. It's interesting.
Okay.
Well, this is at the exhibit here in Washington.
I don't know.
Yes.
I don't have the list for exhibit. Sorry.
I remember it for sure.
Was it there? Oh,
yes,
you did. Oh,
you
see. Okay, it was.
Okay.
I remember seeing it as well. It is in the exhibit.
Okay.
And
Okay.
can you help us with the woman's hand on the right? Does she have a little glass there? And what's next to what are those things next to her hand?
Okay, so it's no more legible to me than it is to you. This looks like a glass, and this looks like a larger glass. So I don't know what this is. This might be a cover for this. Maybe it's a jar, but it looks transparent because we see the tablecloth. It's barely, I don't know what this is. I always thought this is a shadow, but I don't know what the green thing is. You should look at it. If you go into the exhibition, come back and tell us what that is. Okay, the nudes. How would the Nabis do the nudes? The intimate Nabis. So it's a very, very intimate nude. So this is later, and I didn't even know whether to include it or not because it's outside of the dates of the Nabis. It's from 1925. But I just wanted to show you that he sticks with this aesthetic of a pattern. So this is Nude in the Bath from 1925. Oil on canvas, and the you see there are two bodies in this painting, and one of them is nude. And this is his partner, Marta, and they lived together since 1893. They married that year, the year of the painting, and she figures in over 300 of his works. So she becomes a model for him. So Marta had a chronic throat infection. And what was suggested to her as a remedy is frequent baths. So there are these recurring numerous bath scenes that Bonnard does that include her. So again, this is a very modern image. He is modernizing a conventional genre of a horizontal female nude, which we've seen over and over and over since the time of the Venetian Renaissance. And of course, Titian championed and popularized it. But we don't see the whole body here. We see the bottom half of the body, mostly the legs. And so that creates a vertical that leads our eye into the painting. Whoops. But the strongest vertical is, of course, the rim of the bath that leads us into the depth. There's more depth here. And yet you have this very strong geometric structure. The painting is bisected by the rim in the center here, and, I would say 3/4 towards the back by the horizontal line of the bath. Then you have another bisection, the two lines of the rug that echo the two lines of the bath. And of course, where the porcelain bath is gleaming, and this white is an impressionistic white, actually. It's a white that contains all the colors, the pink and the blue and the yellow, if you look at it closely. And the rug is much flatter, as rugs are, and much more simplified in terms of color. It's no longer tonal exploration, but this very jarring contrast of orangish yellow and orangish and red and blue and a little bit of green. Very vivid pattern, floral pattern. So there is another figure, which I mentioned over here. It's a standing figure. He's wearing a robe. This is actually Bonnard, and he's cropped his head off, just like he did of the nude, and about the half of the body remains outside of the canvas. So when you crop the figures, you make the space appear smaller, right? Because the effect that you're creating is that they couldn't fit into the canvas, even though the canvas might be oversized. So it conveys an effect of intimacy. And again, it creates this sort of effect of us being a peeping Tom viewer, right? How else would we catch a glimpse of somebody in the bath? So we are somewhere by the head of the bath, standing, because we're looking down at the body in it. Okay, do you have any questions about anything by Bonnard? Or this nude? Nope. Okay. So the last artist that we're going to talk about is a friend of Bonnard, is another intimist like Bonnard, and his name is Edouard Vuillard. He is a son of a naval captain who dies fairly early on, and a seamstress. His mother is a seamstress, and that has the most important influence on his style. So this is not a wealthy family. It's not a well-off family. He wins a scholarship to a lyceum where he studies rhetoric and art, and he starts by copying Michelangelo and other classical sculptors. He applies to the Academy of Fine Arts twice, and he gets in there on a second try. So he's persistent about receiving this very rigorous artistic education. And then he studies with a very traditional artist by the name of Jean-Léon Gérôme, who is an academic artist who likes these sort of exotic subjects of harems and odalisks and lions, but very bright, very sort of pattern-oriented painter as well. He is in the military for a short time, then he joins the Nabis. His first exhibition is with the Nabis, and in 1892, he produces his very famous panels, apartment panels, which he calls apartment frescoes that we're going to look at. So he says that you cannot look at painting as reproducing nature. He says we need to look at the painting as a set of relations that are definitely detached from any idea of naturalism. A form or a color exists only in relation to another. Form does not exist on its own. We can only conceive of the relation. So what is he talking about? He's talking about not reproducing the object, but focusing on the relationships between the objects. Which is, again, this is a fact, an aspect of abstraction, this sort of approach. So his nickname is the Nabis Zouave because of his military service. There is a regiment called the Zouave Regiment. And we will see lots of domestic scenes, lots of images of an interior self that is absorbed and alienated from the world. And we're also going to see really large scale screens and murals. And just like with Bonnard, pattern is more important than the body. So these are his very popular and often commissioned decorative panels. So this one, the Public Gardens, from 1894, he produces for very famous publisher, avant-garde art and literature publisher, Teddy Nathanson, I'm sorry. So there are 4 groups of these panels that are produced for that specific apartment and are supposed to go on 4 specific walls. So each wall will have a composition. And when you're in the room, you have this narrative, the story about the public gardens. Again, the public garden is an absolute novelty. That is a modern urban space that did not exist before. So this is all about the now, the moment. So this is girl playing the questioning, the nursemaids, the conversation. No, wait, this is the conversation. This is the red parasol. Then you have the promenade and the first steps, the 2 schoolboys, and under the trees. So the problem with these panels is that they've all gotten separated and ended up in separately in various museums. So and not all of them have been published together. So these, whatever the panels I'm showing to you together should match in terms of color. But museums take their pictures in different lighting. So sometimes there is a variation, but the color is a little off because the picture was taken in a private collection. This is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. So this is the promenade, and this is the first steps. So you have 2 influences here. One from the Impressionism in the subject matter, which is modern, naturalistic, contemporary, urban space. That's an Impressionistic subject matter. Open air, city park, the effects of the sun on the ground, the sort of speckling of the sand by the light, the trees and the sky sort of creating this very pleasant landscape. And the second influence is from the Japanese screens. That is the inspiration for that aesthetic object in an apartment. All the compositions are asymmetrical. They're decentered. There is no focal point, really. It seems to be an arbitrary cropped image, a snapshot. And another very non-impressionistic thing is the technique. The way that he layers color creates this impasto which could be seen as impressionistic, except it's not about capturing the effect of light, but about creating a texture. It's very matte and it's very muted, unlike what you see in impressionist painting. And this idea of the dots of color, which you have in other post-impressionists, like in the pointillist movement, is actually an inspiration from his visit to the museum that houses wonderful medieval tapestries in Paris, Musée de Cluny. So he's looking at his paintings like a craftsman would look at the tapestry. He's weaving things together. And there's this repetition of a building block of a spot of color, unblended individual dots of color, like a strand of color in the tapestry. So that makes the surface much flatter, this repetition, the sort of mechanized repetition here. So this is another differently lit photograph. The Two Schoolboys, which is in Belgium, and Under the Trees, which is in the Cleveland Museum of Art. So if you can just imagine all of these panels, you walk into the room and all of the walls have these huge panels. They're fairly big. So they're about 100 inches long, tall. So you have this natural backdrop to your ordinary daily life. And it creates this sort of an effect of a garden in an interior. And then if you look closely at the figures in these paintings, you will start to notice that there are no men there. It is just women and children, because that is how gendered the spaces are in 19th century Paris. And to add onto this, the women never show us their faces. They're either far away, or they are sort of crouching on benches, or they're turning away, or they're hiding their face under their parasols. So it's this sort of hidden world, hidden feminine world that is happening in the public garden, which is probably a commentary or a reflection on the 19th century middle-class gendered reality. So the interior of the room with these panels becomes a microcosm of the outside world. And the domestic interior becomes the same as the psychological interiority of these women, right? So you're in the intimate space of your own room, and then you're in the intimate space inside of your own head. But again, this patterned surface, the flatness of the mosaic, is what the Nabis are all about. Do you have any questions about the decorative panels before we move on? Nope. Okay. So the last batch of paintings are these interiors with the dressmaker. So as you remember, his mother is a seamstress, and she takes her work home. They live in a series of small apartments. So Vuillard is surrounded by fabric. And the color and pattern of fabric is really what he paints and what he loves to paint. And so he produces a series of these dressmaker shops, which is based on his mother's way of working. One of which is the flowered dress from 1891. This is in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And again, you have this very small interior, very confining, and you have the figures that are absorbed in whatever it is they are doing. And it is his family, his grandmother, his mother, and his sister Marie. And her dress, we don't see, Marie doesn't have a face, neither really do his grandmother or mother. But Marie's dress becomes the focus of the painting. And it is featured twice in the painting because there's a large mirror on the back wall. But what that mirror also does, it further makes the spatial relationships ambiguous. It's not, there's sort of this confusing doubling of the figure in the mirror, and she's much too small in it. That shouldn't be the case there. So the space is made up of areas of color, and not just the areas of color, but the areas of different pattern. So you have the floral wallpaper, then you have the floral dress, then you have the solid brown over here, you have the white and pink marble, perhaps of the ledge, this sort of muted greenish ochreish fabric that they're working with, a little bit of orange over here, but they're patches of pattern and color. You put them together and they click into this puzzle. There is no difference here between an inanimate object and the human body. The hierarchy has been destroyed. People don't have faces. We see them from the side. Even when we see them from the front, they don't have any features there. What is dominant, what is more important, are the inanimate patterns on the fabrics. And these patterns become alive. This is the most animated patch in the whole of the composition. So this is another painting, the last painting I'm going to show you in this lecture. This is the Suitor. This is at the Smith College Museum of Art. And in 1893, it's a fairly small painting. It's about 14 inches, I think, 13 inches even. And this is clearly, I think, encapsulates what the Nabis intimacy are all about, the pleasures of the pattern that I titled the lecture with. So here there's, again, his mother and his sister Marie, and they're working on something in the workshop. They're sewing or ironing, as it appears. And then Marie's fiance, who is another Nabis painter, interrupts their work by walking in. The floral pattern really overwhelms any sort of architecture. So even the door is covered in a floral pattern. And he interrupts not just their work, but the pattern. It seems to change behind his back as he is walking in. He has destroyed it. He's disturbed this inner intimate moment. The floral dress that Marie is wearing echoes the wallpaper and also echoes the blooming tree outside. The white flowers on the black branches is an echo of that black dress or burgundy dress with the white flowers on it. So what you also have here is the destruction or the erasure of the distinction between the organic and the man-made, the floral textile and the tree, which makes the flowers, they grow there. So the figures are locked into these patterns. They have the pattern of their surroundings, which is the pattern of their life, to put it metaphorically. That patterning is reiterated through space. It is repeated through space, which is basically what their work is. The series of repetitive movements, which strips them of their individuality, which makes their faces unimportant. It is their job, it is their work, the process, the repetition that becomes important here. And so they merge with the space. Each family member inhabits his own or her own separate world. The couple is interacting with each other, and even in that interaction, the suitor seems to be absorbed by something inside his head, by his thoughts, rather than by his fiancée. So there is this very cozy, intimate, pretty interior domesticity and this very complicated set of relationships, of drama underlying it. Okay, so this is it for the lecture. Do you have any questions about anything? Any questions about who we are? Yes.
I had a quick one. When I look at this painting particularly, I think of Gustav Klimt. Was he a contemporary of these, or did he come later and was influenced by the Nabis?
He is later, and you are right, there is this sort of over cluttered surface, right, that we have in Klimt as well. In Klimt is very much concentrating on patterning. So it's a similar aesthetic. I think it's a very similar aesthetic that you have here, except that Klimt will give us fantasy and mythology, and he'll use real gold. So he is much more removed from reality than Vuillard or Bonnard. He's not interested in the ordinary.
Do you think they would have seen each other's work, or Klimt would have seen the work of the Nabis?
I think so. I think he would have seen it. I don't know. I don't know enough about Klimt, but they're close enough in age, and Vienna had all of these exhibitions by the French artists at the time. So I think so. That's a very interesting question to which I don't have an answer.
It's a first for me, an interesting question. Thank you.
No, your questions are interesting. Don't put me on the spot. Any other questions about any of the Nabis that we covered today? No. Nope.
Actually, I keep thinking about how you were talking about Bonnard painting on the rolls and then cutting them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like I was like the bath one there. Or that one. Like, do you think that he had painted more and then he cut that out?
Yes, I've read that he did that sometimes.
So is it wrapped around a stretcher so he'd have to cut a little larger? I mean, it's just interesting.
I don't think that was stretched.
What
I read, and okay, so I might be wrong, but from what I read, it was a canvas roll, and the roll was lying on the floor while he was painting it. So can you stretch it while it's still sort of a roll?
No, it would have to be when you're done, but you'd have to leave enough to put around the edge.
Right. I was also curious about this, but I found this one sort of piece of information, and that's all I got. I didn't do further research into that, but I think it was from how I understood it, how it was described, it was sort of hanging on the wall, unstretched, and it pulled on the floor, and he would paint, and then he would cut.
Interesting. Yeah, because you can imagine that there was more to this.
Yes, a larger sort of covered pictorial area, and he would work on several canvases at the same time, which I don't understand how that works. But the Impressionists did something similar. Monet, when he was working on his haystacks, would move from canvas to canvas, because for him, it was about capturing a specific light. So each canvas captured a specific light. So he moved 5 minutes, but it's a completely different objective here. So it's just perhaps a little bit of ADHD. We'll diagnose now.
Well, artists can, there's a huge advantage to cropping like this because he could create tension on these edges of the painting after the fact. So you either stretch the canvas before you start working, or you put it on a surface afterwards. And if you're going to stretch it, you better have some extra to wrap around the frame.
Yeah.
But it lets you make decisions differently, and I suspect he enjoyed that.
Yeah, but I'm less sort of fascinated by this than by him working on several canvases at the same time.
Right.
That I can't sort of conceive of that. Changing your focus that quickly, or sort of not concentrating at all. I don't know. Maybe it's more of an automated sort of process in your head. So do you think you have an idea of who the Nabis are?
Yes, absolutely.
And who Bonnard is as an artist? Okay. but because that's my objective. I don't expect you to remember the titles or the dates, but I want you to understand who he was and what. Okay, so as somebody once said, the point of art history, of an art historian, is to explain to you why a thing looks like that. So hopefully, why do they make these aesthetic choices? Because each aesthetic objective has a philosophy behind it, and hopefully I have explained their sort of philosophy to you and what they were striving for, and why it looks the way it does.
I do have one more
Irina,
question. Were either of these artists successful in their own lifetime? I mean, like monetarily?
Yeah. Literally. So the Nabis, some of them were because they've lived. Well, let's see. When did Voyard die? I mean, Bonnard. Let's see. Okay, so he lived until 1947. So he's lived through World War One, World War Two. He's lived through this sort of splintering of artistic movements, and they've changed. I'm just showing you the period of the career where they wore the Nabi. The Nabi only lasted for 10 years, and that some of them remained within the aesthetic, and some of them didn't. And then, as they said, we got overtaken by Cubism before we said everything we wanted to say, meaning people switched. Cubism became the avant-garde movement. And then you have surrealism. So it was this very fertile time. So yes, I'm sorry, I went on a tangent. Yes, some of them, I mean, they lived as professional artists and they supported themselves. And Bonnard and Vuillard were successful. And Denis even before them, because one of Denis' biggest supporters was a very, very wealthy Russian guy. So Denis traveled to Moscow and painted things for to decorate his mansion.
Was it the same Russian guy that collected Matisse?
Yes, Morozov, yes. I can't believe you remember that. Yes. He was supporting all sorts of avant-garde French artists. And Matisse is right there. The Fauves are sort of coming up. Also a short-lived movement, but a very important one.
And he was a neighbor of Monet, and Monet would come over and look at his paintings, and he would go look at Monet's paintings. And I think he was good friends with Matisse.
Bonnard.
Yeah.
Matisse or Monet?
Bonnard.
Okay, you said Monet, and I was like, who was friends with Monet?
Monet was Bonnard's neighbor.
Monet was Bonnard's neighbor.
Yes.
Yes.
And he would come to his studio, and he would go to his studio.
Yes. So no, they were not, just because they challenged the aesthetic didn't mean they hated each other. Sometimes it does, like Picasso and Matisse did not get along. Or Picasso and Dali. Nobody got along with Dali. Because
you mentioned that they were professional artists and he lived a very long life.
Yeah.
Do you know if he evolved to go into Cubism or Surrealism, or did he try to keep
So the Bath, he didn't. The Bath is one of his later works. So this is what he would look like as a later artist, 1925. Well, I mean, it's later. He died in 47, but he's still doing sort of Nabis-esque sort of things, as you can see here.
Are there any other questions? I mean, Irina, you've been very generous with your time.
I am completely free. I can answer all the questions you have. Do you have any questions? No? Did I explain everything perfectly? Okay.
You usually do. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you so much for speaking with us again. Is there another question there, or am I interrupting someone?
I can't see the chat because I hit the panel, but please speak up.
I had a question.
Yes.
Given their idea of color representing a spiritual element, and their interest in pattern and flatness, that they still all have images of real life in their paintings, and didn't just go to abstraction.
Right. As you can see, they stay tied to the world.
Yeah.
The recognizable things in all of these paintings, they haven't quite jumped that last sort of hurdle, right? It's
Right.
not pure abstraction. We would describe this as abstracted somewhat. And the color, I just want to sort of make this clear. The color doesn't have the spiritual element. The color is a vehicle of emotion. The first group of the Nabi that we talked about, the mystics, they used spirit sort of subjects, spirituality and mysticism. But yeah, you wouldn't call them abstract painters. They still, a body is a body. It's a recognizable. It's done from observation, from the memory of the observation. A dog is a dog, right? You can recognize everything. So they're looking at things. It's just they're not wedded to creating an illusion of things. They want to convey a subjective perception.
Irina, I have a question.
Yes.
Well, as a child, I always loved his paintings because of the little dogs in all the paintings. And so do you know what the history of that is?
The history of the dog?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean? Like, was it a famous dog? It was just their family dog.
No, I don't know. I'm just curious. Very few other artists had these little dogs in all their paintings.
Well, there are artists, even in Renaissance. It's interesting. The dogs. I remember at some point I got sort of curious about this because in older paintings and Renaissance paintings, you have breeds that we don't have anymore. So I've read about this. The dogs that don't look like any of the dogs you can meet here. I think it's a choice because what he's trying to. What is he giving us? He's giving us this domesticity. So for him, domesticity includes his dogs or a cat, a cigarette. It's whatever. It's where it's this sort of warm, intimate world, and that obviously a personal choice for him to include dogs, which we appreciate.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, one of the fabulous things about this picture is that it's a tablecloth that's the highlight of the picture in a certain sense.
Right? That's exactly what it is. That's the
just like in some of his other pictures, the gowns that the women were wearing are so fabulous.
Right, because the point is the pattern.
The pattern.
The surface, the decorative surface. And you do this, here it's done with this expanse of a tablecloth. Okay. Thank you for listening. Unless you have any more questions.
Irina, I'm going to go ahead and cut us off right now. You've been so generous with your time and sharing this knowledge of this time period and these artists. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
We will definitely be having you back again because we love it every time you present to us. So thank you so very much. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and for everyone that was on the Zoom today, thank you for joining in.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Patrick, too.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Good night.
Great
Thank you.
presentation.